start by just reading one pasuk carefully, and then we'll start with the man. I want to start with the man. We started with the Rashi yesterday with a Rashi study. I want to jump a few psukim ahead and read a pasuk about the man. If we have time, we'll read the next pasuk about the man. But I want to see this one verse about the man. So you go to chapter 16, verse 21. It says, Vayokatu oso baboker baboker. And they gathered up the man every single morning. Ish kafi acho, each person according to what he eats. V'chama shemesh v'namas. And then, after they gathered it up, the sun grew hot and it would melt. Should say that when I was in northern Saudi Arabia and we went to Har Sinai, I was very curious to see if there was like something that grew in that area, which maybe could have been considered to be the man. I was going around talking to all the Arabs who live down there in northern Saudi Arabia. Is there anything that could be the man? And they thought I was crazy. So they had not. They didn't have anything. So it was obviously a miracle. So what does it mean that they gathered up the man every single morning, baboker, each person according to what they could eat, and then when the sun grew hot, it melted. Now Rashi here is very, very provocative. Rashi says the following: Hanishar basadet. When Rashi comments on the verse, on the words, and when the sun grew hot, it would melt. Rashi says, Hanishar basadet nasa nechalim. And whatever remained in the fields became a river, or a little river, like a wadi. The man, which was gathered, basically would dissolve into these like rivers, these streams. Vishotin mimenu ayalim utzvayim. And then the gazelles and the deers would drink from them. Meaning to say, it didn't just melt into the ground. It became like a little stream, and that there were wild animals which would drink from them. These animals were the gazelles and the deer. And then the non-Jewish nations of the world would come along and trap the gazelle and the deer. V'toan min bahem taman. And then they would taste, by eating the gazelle and the deer, the gazelles and the deer, they'd be tasting the man. Let me just repeat this again. The man was the food that the Jewish people ate in the wilderness. They said, we have nothing to eat. We run out of food. God gave them man that fell down every single morning. And the verse says they would collect it every day. And then whatever they didn't collect in the morning, it grew hot and it melted. So Rashi tells us, what do you mean it melted? It didn't dissolve. It turned into a river. And then the deer and the gazelles would come along, drink from that river. And then the nations of the world would come and slaughter the gazelles and the deer and eat from them. And when they ate the gazelles, they'd be tasting the taste of the manna. V'yodim ma'ashivchan shel Yisrael. And then they would realize just how great was the praiseworthiness of Israel, that the Jewish people were receiving such a reward that we were getting the man. And the word namas, Rashi says, according to the Targum, is lukewarm water, pesher, lashon poshrim, meaning to say through the sun, the man would be warmed and it would melt. Okay, so I want to just first of all, ask you the following question. This is a very, very provocative Rashi. Let's just stop for a moment. All the verse says is that the man would get would melt in the afternoon. Doesn't say anything about the deer and the gazelles drinking it. And next thing you know, the nations of the world are tasting the taste of the man by eating from the deer and the gazelles who drank from the water, which was the melted man. And basically the man nourished the water, the gazelles drank from the water, they ate the gazelles, and they tasted a little bit of the man. A gazelle is kosher animal. The Jews could have eaten it also, but so the Jews were, that just leads me to the question that I was going to ask, and I'm curious to see if anybody has an answer for it. Why is it that why do we care? Why do we care that the nations of the world are tasting the taste of the man by eating from the gazelles? It seems so off point. It has nothing to do with the context here. Why is it so important for Rashi to go on this tangent? And I also want to point out that Rashi is not the source for the idea. It comes from the Mechilta, but Rashi decided that he's told us several times he only wants to teach us the literal reading. So Rashi goes to this extreme. He goes on this midrash, which is not necessarily motivated by overwhelming textual need. So I want to get to an answer for that, but before we get to an answer, I want to read the Balaturim, but let me stop for a moment. I see Bruce and April have their hands, so let me pause. So before I want to share an approach to why we care what the nations of the world that they were tasting the man, why is it even relevant to us? I want to cite the Balaturim here because the Balaturim is so important just to see the overwhelming rabbinic context of the Manna, about how, and I think by reading this Balaturim, we'll see just how revolutionary Rashi's approach was. Rashi is writing in the 11th century. The Balaturim is writing in the late 14th, actually probably the early 15th century. So the Balaturim here cites a lot of sources. Let me read the commentary of the Balaturim. It says, V'cham Shemesh b'namas. The word V'cham, the Balaturim tells us, appears 3 times in the Tanakh. There's actually a question. Some say it appears 3 times, but other editions of the Balaturim say that it's 4 times. But it's a whole question. Anyway, that's all dispute. And another problem with this Balaturim is that one of the sources that he cites, where he says V'chama Shemesh v'namas, is actually not the word hot, but the son of Noah, who was Cham. And so how could that count? And if we count them, then it would be 6, not 4. Anyway, so that's a whole question. But he's going to cite 3 verses that he thinks are relevant. One is this verse, and then the second verse is V'cham hu avi Canaan. Cham is the father of Canaan. Like we said, that's really a totally different meaning. And then the third context is or actually, that depends whether we say 3 or 4. And then the third is the Cham Ladoni HaMelech, and this is when David's family was trying to keep him warm, so they found a young maiden, and they had her sleep in David's bed just to keep him warm, like a professional body warmer. That was Avishag Hashunamit. And then the verse from Ecclesiastes. In Yishkavu Shnayim V'cham Lahem, that if two will sleep together, it'll be warm. So the idea is that the Baal HaTurim is citing these verses to tell us that the word V'cham Hashemesh V'namas, that when the sun grew hot, the manna melted, actually has a connotation that relates to physical intimacy in the bedroom. That, first of all, we know that it will be warm for Adoni HaMelech, right? So they had to give David a maiden, Avishag, and we'll say if two will sleep together, it'll be warm for them. So too here. So what's the relationship? Here we're talking about something totally removed. This is just manna falling down and melting, like it goes spoiled in the middle of the day. What does this have to do with a bedroom where people are keeping each other warm? This is the brilliance of the Baal HaTurim. So he says that there's a statement in the tractate Yoma that it says the man was used to clarify paternity. The man was used to clarify who was the father. So let's say a person got married, let's say a woman became a widow, and even though she wasn't supposed to, she didn't wait 3 months after her first husband died before remarrying. And then she has a child who's born, and we're not sure if the child is premature from the first marriage, premature from the second marriage, or a full-term delivery from the first marriage. And so therefore, we don't know who the father is. And we need to know for inheritance, for Jewish law, for tribal purposes. So how would they determine who the father was? The base mishin imtza omer shelo haya aviv. In the home of whoever was the omer would go according to each person's home. So they would go in front of the tent of the father of this offspring. And so that's how you would be able to determine, who the father was. So too, that's what it means from the verse. If two sleep together, it will be warm for them. Meaning to say, if two husbands live with the same wife together, and we can't figure out who the actual father is, and there will be a heated argument over who is the father, then wherever the man melts, that's the proof of who the father is. So the man was used not only to nourish the children of Israel, it was used to solve this very, very difficult legal question. They didn't have DNA testing, so that's how they figured it out. So too, the Baal HaTurim is great here. So too, it solves another question. Let's say a man tossed let's say he tossed something of value towards a woman, and he says, if this would land within your area, then you'll be married to me. But we don't know if she was actually married. So the man proved whether or not they were married. How so? If her portion of the man fell in front of that man's tent, it means that she was married to him. So the man was able to prove who was the child, and the man also proved who was this man, if this woman was married. And the Baal HaTurim says that we also find that in the verse, because it says, it will be warm for my master, the king. And so therefore, this is the proof that the fact is that wherever the Omer is, the sun will warm it. And so too, the Baal HaTurim says, we learn the third verse, Ham is the father of Canaan, that it would clarify the ownership of the slaves. If two people claimed ownership, if you had a Canaanite slave, which they didn't have in the wilderness, but wherever the man fell, that would clarify it. And that's why it says Ham is the father of Canaan. Anyway, so these are this is the way the Baal HaTurim is able in his genius to connect this word to the three times it appears. And he quotes from my father, the Rosh of blessed memory. Okay. Then the Baal HaTurim cites the same midrash that Rashi cites, and I'll be able to see what the Baal HaTurim says here with you, and then we'll go to the question. So Vinamat said it melted. He says that this word appears twice. Once it means here, and the other it says in Psalms 112, he will mash his teeth and melt away. And unlike Rashi, who says that the purpose of that when the nations of the world would taste the gazelles who drank from the water, they'd be able to tell the flavor of the manna and thereby praise the Jewish people. The Baal HaTurim gives a different explanation. He says, when they would taste this sample from the deer or the gazelles, they would grind their teeth and their heart would melt about the good of the Jewish people, about the good of Israel. So we see that this midrash is cited by Rashi to say they would realize the praiseworthiness of Israel, and the Baal HaTurim who says they would realize just how they would regret that they weren't as blessed as the Jewish people. But I go back to my question. Does anybody here have a different approach? Why was it so important for the nations of the world to taste the taste of the manna from the gazelles or the deer? Anybody have an answer? Okay, I see nobody is raising their hand. Nobody is raising their hand. So I would like to read. I saw this beautiful explanation from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then I want to share my explanation. The Rebbe writes, now the Rebbe himself wrote a commentary on the Rebbe himself wrote a commentary on Rashi, but let me pause here for a second. Morris has a question. So first of all, I want to say just the powerful imagery of the nations of the world tasting the manna is such a powerful image that the non-Jews of the world also taste the manna. And this is a theology, in my mind, that can make sense of how we can possibly think that 10 million or 15 million Jews are the chosen people when the world is, I don't know how many billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, I don't know how many billion there are in the world, 3 billion, who knows? Give or take a billion here or there, whatever it is. How can we imagine that we, which are these minuscule people, can have an impact? And the way I could think about it is, if we're tasting the manna really is Torah, something that comes straight down from God. And then we use the manna and bring out its impact to the world. And it goes like a stream of water. The water represents the Torah. And whatever we are able to produce in the world from our Torah is then lapped up by the nations of the world. So even though we're not directly teaching Torah to the nations of the world. The nations of the world are benefiting from this beautiful manna that we're ingesting, the beautiful Torah, and we're able to share it in a way that has a powerful impact on the world. That's the way I just imagine the power of this midrash. That's the way I imagine this power of this midrash. But let's see what the Rebbe says, because I think you'll see a very different answer than what Rashi and the Baal HaTurim suggest. And so the Rebbe asks the question, why do we need this Rashi to tell us about what the nations of the world were drinking? And how does this synthesize how does this follow in the line of what Rashi says? I only come to explain the simple meaning of the verses. So the Rebbe says the question of what happened to the remaining man only became an issue after we learned in the verses, we learned a little bit earlier, that they went out, Dasan and Aviram, went out, they did not leave. Moshe said, don't leave anything over. And they did not listen to Moshe, and they left it over till the next morning, and it became wormy, and so their man became foul. So they weren't supposed to go out into the fields. They weren't supposed to leave it over. So they left it over, and it became wormy. But here we're being told that if you leave it over, it will melt in and turn into water. So there's a distinction. So the Torah is telling us at this point, don't worry about it. Whatever you left over eventually became water, and it didn't go to waste. It had an impact. It was drunk up by the gazelles, and then the nations of the world tasted it. So then this begs the question, why does the Torah only tell us this at this point? Why doesn't it tell us this? I mean, it's hard to, unless you're looking at the text of the Torah, you would notice that the man was introduced 20 to 30 psukim earlier. So why is it just being told at this point what happens to the leftover man? So therefore, Rashi is bringing this explanation to teach us, says the Rebbe, why it was included at this point. So Rashi's answer is that the other verses were talking about the greatness of the Jewish people. And so therefore, the melting of the man, Rashi is saying, is also talking about the greatness of the Jewish people. Because verse 21 says that they gathered it every morning, meaning after Moshe told them, don't leave anything over, then everybody listened and gathered it every morning. Even Dasan and Aviram, even the wicked ones. And verses 22 through 29 describe, after we're told that about the sun melting, what's the next thing that we're told about? And it was on the sixth day they gathered a lechem mishnah. That's the source of the idea of one perhaps of having 2 loaves of bread on the Shabbos table. And then they observed the Shabbos and they kept it over for the next morning, and it didn't get wormy. And Moshe said, eat it on Shabbos. 6 days you shall gather, on the 7th day you shall rest. So, and then we have the mitzvah of Shabbos. So, God giving the Shabbos to the Jewish people is also an expression of the greatness of the Jewish people in getting the Shabbos. So Rashi is citing this midrash here to tell us about, it's also in the context of the greatness of the Jewish people. I was also thinking that this answer of the Rebbe also relates to this idea that this is like Shabbos, the gift of Shabbos to the world. Those who are able to celebrate it, appreciate it, recognize it, it's such a powerful spiritual experience. But I think we can never underestimate just the power of the reflection of what Shabbos brings into the world. Just the reflection of what Shabbos brings into the world. That even those who are only able to taste the reflection of Shabbos are powerfully influenced by it. When was the commandment of Shabbos given? Well, the commandment of Shabbos was actually given in the Ten Commandments, but we already have references to Shabbos earlier in the Torah. In the at the very beginning of Genesis, we were told that Hashem rested on the seventh day. And God rested on the seventh day. And then also in chapter 15, verse 25, in this week's parasha, it tells us that after they crossed the sea, it says they came to this place called Mara. And at Mara, it says, there God gave them choku mishpat v'sham nisau. God gave them laws and judgment. And Rashi writes that God gave us at Mara some of the commandments. What commandments did he give us? Rashi says he gave us 3 commandments. The red heifer, the paraduma, which is a debate whether it actually gave us that. He gave us laws of judgments, and he gave us the mitzvah of Shabbos. So what's Rashi's source? So that's based upon the Gemara Sanhedrin, which we're going to get to actually this week in our Daf Yomi, Sanhedrin 56, that says that at this point they were given the mitzvah of Shabbos, and they need to have been given the mitzvah of Shabbos right when they crossed the sea, because how else are they going to understand about the man? So Ramban writes that they weren't actually given all of the commandments of Shabbos at that point once they crossed the sea. Rather, they started learning about Shabbos because they knew that in the future God would actually command them. So they were introduced to the concept, kind of like when somebody is becoming a Jew by choice. When we tell them about the Shabbos, we don't say go out and observe it right away. We start introducing the idea to them. And so that's why here in verse 22, when it says that it was on the 6th day and they came and they told Moshe that there was a double portion, that this is why they were so shocked, because even though they knew about the concept, they hadn't yet started to observe it. So that's why Moshe said to them, this is what Hashem told you, that Shabbason, Shabbos Kodesh LaHashem Echar. Tomorrow is a day of rest for Shabbos. Today, bake whatever you want, cook whatever you want, but tomorrow is a day of rest. So everything will be done in advance. So, but there's no idea that Moshe said to them, do any of the other laws of Shabbos. Like, for example, never told them to make Kiddush there. Never told them to refrain from other activities. So therefore, the only one that they were told not to do at that point was to cook on Shabbos. So at this point, we're seeing here that the only commandment associated with the man is the commandment of Shabbos. The commandment of Shabbos. And this is telling us what I think, to my mind, is telling us something incredibly powerful. Today, we no longer have the man, but that's not exactly true. The man, the rabbis tell us, tasted like whatever you wanted. I think that the man today is Shabbos. Shabbos is the man. It's like this item, this concept of whatever you put into it, you'll get out of it. And yet at the same time, it's completely nourishing, completely inspiring, transformative. One of the explanations of the man, why it was called man, is that after that it was the food of angels. The Gemara tells us that man is the food of angels. And also, we're also told that after they ate the man, there was a spiritual transformation in each of the people. And so though they were saying, man, who is this person who just ate from it? I think that that's the Shabbos. So the man in the time of the wilderness is intricately linked with the Shabbos. And today, the Shabbos is like the man. So when we observe the Shabbos, we're spiritually transformed. Shabbos is like the food of angels in the sense that once we eat it, we're just on a whole nother level. The Lubavitcher Rebbe makes the following point. He says, Shabbos and Manna share two main themes. He says, one, the manna was given in an edible form, so the Jewish people did not have to bother preparing the food. And so too, Shabbos is a day of rest from the tiresome activities of the week. So on a certain level, Shabbos is a day where we don't have to worry about physical preparations. Obviously, anybody who hosts on Shabbos would beg to differ, but that's the basic idea, that man is the ultimate takeout food or take-home food. So too, Shabbos is a day where you're not preparing food. And number two, the man was known for being an incredibly delicious food, and just like Shabbos, which is a day of intense pleasure. And so therefore we have this connection between the manna and the Shabbos. So now I'm going to say one more point from the Rebbe, and then I'll go back to another idea. So this is the Rebbe's summary of it, and then maybe we could summarize it in our mind. The man reminds us that a Jew's food and his livelihood in general come straight from God, like bread from heaven. Meaning to say, a person is always thinking, okay, my livelihood comes from me, but the man shows it comes straight from heaven. Shabbos also is the same idea. Shabbos is a day in which we don't work. We're reminded ourselves that our work is for Hashem. We have to stop working. Now today it's people, everybody has most places have like a 5-day work week or maybe a 4-day work week. But in the time of the ancient world, it was a revolutionary idea that you wouldn't work every single day. And so that is one of this great ideas. So the Rebbe writes that even though we no longer see bread coming from heaven, the eternal perpetuation of manna through the Shabbos basically is telling us that the bread continues to come from heaven. To my mind, the power of what we're saying is, the power of what we're studying is twofold. That the man equals Shabbos, and what it really equals is this pure spirituality that we're able to absorb into our lives, into our being, into our essence. And whatever we put into it is what we get out of it. But it also, taking us back to the first idea of that it melts and is absorbed in the rivers of the world, is that the impact of the Jewish people is so powerful. The impact of the ideas of the Torah is so powerful that the reflections and the concepts that the Jewish people bring into the world are absorbed into the essence of the physicality of the world, and it is impacting the nations of the world. And that's what I think it goes to the source of why Rashi brought down that midrash. Let me pause for a moment, see if anybody has any questions about it.